The mandibular nerve. The mandibular nerve exits the skull through the foramen ovale. For a short distance, the nerve is undivided, where it gives off several branches to muscles of the inner ear, soft palate, mastication, and dura. It then divides into an anterior trunk and a larger posterior trunk. So let's now trace the branches of the mandibular nerve. So, unlike the maxillary nerve, where we divide the branches into four areas, we study the branches of the mandibular nerve by studying it as first an undivided nerve, and then it divides into an anterior and posterior trunk. Therefore, we call this the divided nerve. Now, there are several branches from the undivided nerve, and also several branches from the anterior trunk of the divided nerve and the posterior trunk of the divided nerve. Okay, so let's now trace the route of the mandibular nerve. This nerve is the largest of the divisions of the fifth cranial nerve, and it contains both motor and sensory fibers, thus it is a mixed nerve. So this is the undivided nerve. As you can see, there's only one trunk, and then it divides into a small anterior trunk and a large posterior trunk, where now we call it the divided nerve. Okay. So this is again the undivided nerve, and short it may be, it still has several branches. While it is still inside the skull, it gives off a sensory branch to the dura. Some books call it the nervus tentori. And then it exits the skull through the foramen ovale, and it gives off several branches. Still, the nerve is undivided, and these branches are sensory and some branches are motor. So one branch is is motor to the internal pterygoid muscle. Another branch is motor to the tensor veli palatini, which is a muscle of the soft palate. While still inside the skull, the undivided nerve also gives off a branch to innervate the mastoid cells. This is the sensory branch. So there are four, and this is the fifth branch. This is the branch to the tensor tympani, which is a muscle of the inner ear. Then, a short distance after it exits the skull through the foramen ovale, the main trunk of the mandibular nerve divides into a small anterior trunk with its own branches and posterior trunk. The anterior trunk will have its own branches, and these are, okay, let's look at first anterior trunk. One branch is motor to the temporalis muscle. Another branch is motor to the external pterygoid muscle. Next will be the nerve to the masseter muscle, another motor branch. And the last one, and the only sensory nerve among all the four branches of the anterior trunk, is the long buccal nerve, which is sensory to the buccal mucosa of all mandibular posterior teeth. Now let's look at the branches from the posterior trunk. Okay, and this one This is the posterior trunk, all of this, including this one, which is the lingual nerve. Okay? The lingual nerve is sensory to the tongue, anterior two-thirds of the tongue, and the lingual mucosa of all mandibular posterior teeth. Now remember, in the lecture in the odonto-osseous structures, on the internal surface of the mandible, there is this very important foramen, which is called the mandibular foramen, which is the entrance to the internal, which is the entrance into the mandibular canal. Let's look at that again. This is the lingual nerve, and we have the mandibular foramen, which is the entrance to the mandibular canal. One more time, we have the lingual nerve, and this is now. Before the main posterior trunk enters the mandibular canal through the mandibular foramen, a small branch or fiber from the main posterior trunk separates, and this is the mylohyoid nerve. It will settle or nestle in the mylohyoid groove at the internal surface of the mandible. Now, the remainder of the main posterior trunk will enter the mandibular canal through the mandibular foramen, and once it enters the mandibular foramen, this main posterior trunk will change its name into the inferior alveolar nerve. Okay? Again, it's a mere changing of name. And the inferior alveolar nerve is not a branch, but it is the remainder of the posterior trunk after it gives off the mylohyoid nerve. Now, inside the mandibular canal, it gives off terminal branches to innervate the pulps of the mandibular posterior teeth, including the mandibular premolars. So the innervation, sensory innervation of the pulps of mandibular posterior teeth will be coming from the inferior alveolar nerve. Now remember again this foramen on the external surface of the mandible at the area of the first and second premolar. This is called, if you remember, the mental foramen. And while inside the mandibular canal, several fibers from the inferior alveolar nerve will come out through the mental foramen to form another nerve, and this nerve is called the mental nerve. Okay? And this mental nerve is merely sensory to the lower lip and chin. It doesn't have anything to do with the mandibular premolars. Okay? It doesn't innervate the pulps of the mandibular premolars. It merely is sensory to the lower lip and chin. Now, after it gives off the mental foramen, the inferior alveolar nerve continues on, what remains of it, towards the midline, where it meets the other half of the mandibular nerve. Now, after it gives off, once it crosses the boundary of the mental foramen, it gives off the mental nerve, it changes its name again. It's not called inferior alveolar nerve anymore, but it becomes the incisive nerve, which is the innervation of the pulps of the mandibular anteriors. That's why I said, do not call the nasopalatal nerve in the maxilla as the incisive nerve, because there is an incisive nerve in the mandible. I hope that is clear. So this is a simple chart to guide you, tells you which nerves to anesthetize if you want to manipulate or touch certain areas of the oral cavity. And this is according to the Palmer's notation, 1 to 8. This is actually Palmer-Zsigmondy. So they dropped the name of Zsigmondy and now it's merely called the Palmer's notation. 1 is the central incisor and 8 is the third molar. So for example, you want to know which nerve innervates the pulps of, or the teeth, which nerve innervates, let's say, the maxillary first premolar. So you just trace it on the table and it tells you that it's the middle superior alveolar nerve. And the palatal innervation. And the innervation of the palatal gingiva of this tooth is from the greater palatine nerve. Example, for the mandibular teeth, if you want to know the innervation of the buccal gingiva of, let's say, the mandibular first molar, then it's with the buccal nerve and perforating branches of the inferior alveolar nerve. Or we can also say that it's the long buccal nerve. So this is how easy it is to use this chart. Now for the tongue, since the tongue came from two brachial or developed from two brachial arches, then the innervation is quite complex. Okay, so we divide the tongue from your lecture. In oral cavity, the tongue is divided into the anterior 2/3 and posterior 1/3. Each of these parts of the tongue came from different brachial arches. So the anterior tooth, and then we have the sensory and motor innervation. For the anterior 2/3, which is the body and tip of the tongue, the innervation will come from the trigeminal nerve, specifically from the lingual nerve branch of the mandibular nerve, posterior tract. While the sensory innervation, the posterior 1/3, which is the base of the tongue, the innervation will come from cranial nerve 9 or the glossopharyngeal nerve because it is already on the pharyngeal area. Now for both the motor innervation, for the motor innervation of both the anterior 2/3 and posterior 1/3, the innervation comes from cranial nerve 12, which is the hypoglossal nerve. This is a rather deep nerve and it's motor, so it innervates the intrinsic and extrinsic muscles of the tongue. Now, as for the sense of taste, it comes from another cranial nerve, which is cranial nerve 7, through a special branch called chorda tympani from the facial nerve. So as you can see, the tongue has several nerves innervating it. Cranial nerve 5 for the trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve 9 or the glossopharyngeal nerve, cranial nerve 12, motor innervation or the hypoglossal nerve, and cranial nerve 7, chorda tympani, through the special branch of the facial nerve called the chorda tympani. So that's it for the mandibular division. Oh, by the way, this is the chorda tympani coming from the 7th cranial nerve. So pictures in this video and from the previous video, which is on the trigeminal nerve and maxillary nerve, came from Monheim's textbook of dental anesthesia and this website from the University of Florida. Thank you.